these aircraft go into the irreplaceable sort of bucket, really. So to regenerate that capability would take a huge number of years, and certainly under a sanctions regime, and the fact that the Russians have sort of reached the zenith, really, of their productive capability in economic terms. I think anything that's written off is written off. What they will do is look at the damage to some of these to see if some of them are repairable. And that, again, is something that we'd see by what we used to call tall building shots. The satellite flypast will give you an indication of whether there's total destruction or whether it's just a kind of wing or things like that.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Chapman, a former British military advisor to US Central Command and author of the book Notes from a Small Military. Chip, welcome.
Good afternoon, Louis. Always good to be here.
Well, Chip, over the weekend, we've seen this pretty significant attack on Russian strategic air bases using Ukrainian drones. How have these attacks unfolded and what is their significance?
Well, firstly, the significance is where. So in terms of escalation, we look at 7 metrics generally: weapons, objectives, targets, geography, domains, rhetoric, or mobilization. So the significant ones here were both in terms of targets and geography. Geography because the most extensive one that they hit was over in Siberia at Belaya, which is 4,300 kilometers from Ukraine. That is way beyond the zone of action, as it were, of any of the Ukrainian cruise missiles. So what they've done is deploy deep into Russian territory to narrow that gap and get close to these bases to conduct this. So that's pretty significant in the way they've done it as an asymmetric attack, because an asymmetric attack using the capabilities of their existing long-range drones or missiles would not have done that. So the where is significant. The why is also significant because, of course, the Ukrainian A2AD, that's anti-air defense systems, have pushed the Russian aviation back so that what the NATO designation bombers of either Bear, Blackjack, or Blinder have had to go further back into Russia and launching their cruise missiles, generally KH-101, from up to 2,800 kilometers away from the targets. That is, they're in safe Russian airspace. So intruding all the way to Siberia means that the drones have gone well into Russian airspace. But more importantly, because they got close to the bases, that meant that the sort of layered air defense that Russia has was sort of negated. It's no point having an S-300 or an S-400 or a Panzer if suddenly parked next to the airfield is a small drone which can take out a significant strategic asset. So that was also significant in this. Now, the how is the really interesting thing, and I think this will be in one of those future books written about the most ingenious attacks in history. It's certainly in the last couple of years up there with the Israeli Mossad attack on Hezbollah using the pager attacks. I mean, it's all those things that you've seen from the Ukrainians about the use of innovation and ingenuity, because, they're a smaller nation, both in population and resources than Russia, but they don't lack anything in ingenuity, and they'll always surprise you with the way that they go about things. So I think all that is significant for the future. I don't think at the moment we know the exact damage that was done. It's said that they may have attempted to strike 5 bases. I think the Russians have said that they were potentially successful at 2, Olenia in Murmansk, which the Ukrainians have tried to attack before with drones from Russia, 1,800 kilometers away, and the Belaya one in Irkutsk Oblast. That's the one over towards Siberia. So the left and right of arc is something like 41 aircraft taken out. The right of arc is as few as 5. I think we will know in the next few days, if not because of battlefield damage assessment by the Ukrainians as much as by the satellite flyovers by either commercial or American assets. And that will give you an indication of what the total damage was. But what you can say, it doesn't really matter if it's 5 or 41 in a way. It was still successful and very cost effective. You can't repeat that method again. That's the only problem you have when you do something of this sort of ingenuity. You can't do another kind of mass breakout in a prisoner of war camp. You can only do that once by tunneling. It's a similar thing with these sorts of methods of operating.
So, I mean, presumably this will have set alarm bells ringing across Russian intelligence to find and make sure there are no more drones hidden anywhere. It's not possible then at this point that there could be more drones hidden in trucks in Russia anywhere else?
I don't think there would be the chance of that particular modus operandi being used again. It would now be too obvious. They would probably revert to some other sort of system. But what it does show is the way that the Ukrainians have penetrated Russia in geography and time, because what they did say yesterday, the Ukrainians, was that of the 117 drones, they were all to be flown independently. If that is true, that would show you that there were 117 different sort of potentially operatives, or one operative flying a number of drones or whatever. But they also managed to use subterfuge to get people to drive those trucks to the location. So there's a kind of rather like a sort of supply chain. There's a supply chain of cunningness all the way from the Ukrainian border to how they did this. So you can say that this was a tremendously well planned and executed operation, even if it doesn't have the totality of success that they might first have alluded to.
And how many of these strategic bombers or aircraft could have been used to target Ukraine? And could this attack help to alleviate some of the bombardment of Kiev and other cities in Ukraine?
Well, that's an interesting question, because at its maximalist number, the Ukrainians said that they destroyed 34% of all the strategic air fleet of the Russians. Now, that also is interesting for another reason. Now, these are dual-use aircraft, which are part of the nuclear triad of Russia, as well as being aircraft that can launch conventional cruise missile weapons. Now, if you've destroyed 43% of the inventory, it is absolutely not the case that you will have 100% of the inventory which is available for operations at any one time, because of cannibalization, spares issues, and all that sort of stuff. Now, that is also really, really important here, because the sortie rate, as it were, and the flying rate of the aircraft has probably been caveated in the last few years by the sanctions regime and the ability to get sort of spares and things like that. Also, none of these aircraft are in production anymore, so they're the lasts of the dying breeds of each of these aircraft. So to replace them when you haven't got a production line would be incredibly expensive. To answer your question specifically, of course, if you've got less aircraft which can launch weapons at you, then that's a good thing from a Ukrainian perspective, because the generation of either sortie rates or things like that is caveated by the total number of aircraft you have. So if you can't knock them down, or the Russians are using, having looked at the measurement of effectiveness assessment, MEA, which they do in any attack. So what is the best mix of weapons, including drones, cruise missiles, or ballistic missiles, to get through a Ukrainian defense? If you want to make that simpler from a Ukrainian perspective, the best way to do that is to go to where the source is, and the source is those long-range aircraft which can launch those cruise missiles. Get rid of that, you solve part of your problem.
And you mentioned there about whether or not these aircraft will be replaceable. I mean, do the Russians have substitutes for them? Can they repair them entirely by themselves, or have sanctions really put a halt to being able to bring in the technology needed to replace this kind of weapon?
No, I think these aircraft go into the irreplaceable sort of bucket, really. So to regenerate that capability would take a huge number of years, and certainly under a sanctions regime, and the fact that the Russians have sort of reached the zenith, really, of their productive capability in economic terms. I think anything that's written off is written off. What they will do is look at the damage to some of these to see if some of them are repairable. And that again is something that we'd see by what we used to call tall building shots. The satellite flypast will give you an indication of whether there's total destruction or whether it's just a kind of wing or things like that.
And more widely, how important are these strategic bombers as a symbol, really, of Russia's and in a way, the Kremlin's power?
Well, I think there are people who've said that this is really, really dangerous because it's upset that balance in the triad of the nuclear arsenal of Russia. So the triad is, of course, the fact that you've got submarines, you've got land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles alongside tactical nuclear missiles, and the third part is your air force or your strategic air force. If you've had quite a lot of that knocked down, then there's an imbalance between your potential adversary that you have that arsenal for. And that, of course, is not against Ukraine. That is not to say that Russia wouldn't use at some stage nuclear weapons against Ukraine, but it's there for a particular strategic reason against the US and Europe in the widest sense. So it kind of upsets that to a slight degree. And that's why it will be interesting as to what the American reaction will be to this. Because, in the last few weeks, we've had Trump saying, hey, it's no problem that Russia, he doesn't like it that Russia's attacking Ukraine with ballistic missiles and cruise missiles because this is war. It'll be interesting to see if he takes the similar view with this attack from Ukraine. It is the same thing as he said 2 or 3 weeks ago. So what will be Trump's reaction? You don't really know because of the mercurial mind of Trump how he's going to kind of play this. But from a targeting perspective, this and in the laws of war, this was legitimate, proportionate, and necessary from a Ukrainian perspective, and also used a sufficient precaution that those targeted were military folk and military assets, i.e. not the civilians you often see being knocked over in attacks on cities in Ukraine.
And we've talked about the strategic and, in a way, tactical importance of these aircraft as well as their political importance. It does kind of leave the question of what it says about Russian security, that these planes seem to have just been sat out on the airfield, uncovered, no attempt to camouflage or protect them seemingly from above, when Russia is in a pretty significant conflict. What does that say about Russia's internal security?
Well, it's first thing it would tell you is that there's a failure of imagination. My old boss, General Mattis, always used to say that force protection is a responsibility, it's not a mission. And in this, they failed in a responsibility. But this is also the dilemma for Russia, because if you attempt to be strong everywhere, you end up by being weak everywhere. And so if you've got limited resources globally within Russia, you have to take a risk-based approach to this. And their risk approach to this would obviously has gone wrong, because the Ukrainians have been able to reach the farthest places in their strategic aviation by this very cunning asymmetric approach to warfare. And therefore, it is a failure of Russian force protection. I'm sure some people will be hanging by out of the windows in the next few days if that's the way that Putin's anger manifests itself. Although, of course, it will manifest itself also, I think, by some sort of response against this. I would say, for example, that there's a fair chance that he would use Oreshnik missiles in the next week or 2 weeks. There's been some talk about him using that in a rhetorical sense, sort of using the fact that, it would obliterate everything in a 3-kilometer radius because of the heat of turn everything to ash because of the 4,000 degree temperature of that sort of weapon system. And that again is also to try and induce a negative reaction in the West to supporting Ukraine. And further, because of course you could link this in Putin's mind with the visit of Zelensky to Germany last week. We know for OPSEC reasons that Merz is not going to release any details of the weaponry that he's giving to the Ukrainians. But what the Taurus would do, if that has been given to Ukraine and the targeting limitations has been taken off, is that would put Moscow in range. The reciprocation from a Russian perspective on that is this sort of threats which have sort of been issued to the Germans that Berlin is in range if the Taurus goes anywhere near Moscow.
And as you mentioned, Russia have begun a response of sorts to this. There was pretty significant drone attacks overnight again. There's been that intensifying air and drone campaign by Russia since the start of the year, really. How damaging is that campaign becoming? And what are the concerns in Ukraine around the availability of anti-aircraft and anti-drone equipment?
Well, the second priority for the Ukrainians after some sort of security guarantee is to ensure that they have viable and continuing air defence assets placed their way. That is their major vulnerability. And as I sort of alluded to earlier, the sort of mix of weapon systems and the sort of going through the targeting cycle by the Russians does complicate the decision making of the Ukrainians. Hence, why they did this sort of attack. It also is part of the sort of psychological thing on America, in particular with the notion that Ukraine is losing. Now, what Ukraine has partially done this for is also to induce both two things: a for its own population to say, as a fillip to morale and psychologically that was still in the game, and B, to tell the Americans and the West that we are not losing, we're still in this game, we're still innovating, please support us. So it's that sort of trade-off. And I think that's what we're going to see really in terms of what is occurring or may or may not occur in the second round of talks in Istanbul today. They're not really peace talks in a way. They're position talks where Russia will probably lay out their stall, which will be towards a surrender peace end of the spectrum, whereas Ukraine will lay out something which is towards a sovereign peace from their perspective. Now, the delta between two of those, a surrender peace and a sovereign peace, are so far apart that I don't see the thing going anywhere in the next few days. And that's where we come into this real key question of when does this sort of 2-week mercurial mind of Trump end, and a decision making either by Trump to put sanctions on Russia or to give further weapon supplies to Ukraine occurs, or we have this sort of quasi split between the executive and the legislature, and you have Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham putting through the Senate a separate sort of bill, which, if they have enough support, Trump may not be able to do anything about, which puts this sanctions and secondary sanctions, of the mooted number is 500% on those who are taking Russian products. By that, they essentially mean oil as much as anything, India, China being positive. So I think that is a key decision point in the next 10 days, particularly that now that the recess is going to be over in America and they'll be back to work shortly.
And I think much of our audience will agree with your skepticism on any breakthrough coming out of the talks, which are underway as we're speaking, Chip. But do you think that there could be other agreements around this? Last time we saw one of the largest prisoner swaps of the conflict. There have previously been ideas around smaller ceasefires on the Black Sea, for example. Is there something like that could come out of these talks today?
Well, there'll be nothing substantive, but both parties want to really stay on the sort of right side psychologically of Trump as they see it. That's one of the key things to do at the moment. So you might have another further prisoner swap. You might have something like that. But in terms of an unconditional ceasefire, forget about the sort of small stuff to do with 30 days on energy or the Black Sea or things like that. Nothing will come out, because here's your fundamental problem again. That Ukraine would like to see an unconditional 30-day ceasefire, and that's really been on the table since the 11th of March. Russia sees a ceasefire as a precondition, and therefore you should have negotiations which then might lead to a ceasefire. So Ukraine are looking at this from a start point. The start point is a ceasefire. Russia are looking at this from the perspective of an end state. Here's what we require, sign up to that, or at least to negotiate that, and then we can go towards a ceasefire. Trying to bridge that, the strategy bridge between those two positions, is incredibly difficult. And that's why we've got these problems, and why you might have minor movements, but nothing substantive and nothing strategic.
And of course, as these talks are happening, the war is carrying on the ground as well. Have there been any major developments on the ground on the front that you've been looking at? And how much of a worry is there in Ukraine about the idea of a new Russian offensive in the coming summer into somewhere like Sumy Oblast?
Yeah, I think that is a legitimate concern. But again, Russia's still got the same problem of how do they overcome the killing zone of the drones and artillery. We've got this fairly transparent battlefield, and instead of blitzkrieg, lightning war, we've got Lanzenkrieg, slow war. So although they might be making, and are in certain areas, incremental gains, the village butchery trade-off in terms of lives lost for territory taken is pretty skewed in favor of Ukraine at the moment. And territory itself doesn't have any meaning unless the tactical successes, capturing a village is a very minor one, ultimately leads to capturing operational objectives. And since 2022, Russia has not captured any significant operational objective or some major settlement. So, one of the major cities that they were looking towards in 2022. I still think that they're probably adopting their tactics now after Bakhmut and Avdiivka. They've now moved to a position where they're looking at a greater distance to try and envelop or encircle places rather than do direct frontal attacks on them. And that's what I think we'll see more in the sort of Sumy region, that it'll be the sort of pincer movements trying to work around these cities to make the defense of them logistically untenable from a Ukrainian perspective. And that's also what we're sort of seeing in Pokrovsk. But again, the defense lines, A, seem to be holding, and B, are being dug in a very perceptive way, it seems to me, at the moment. So again, we have this slowly eroding stalemate, but nothing which is looking towards a significant operational landslide.
Well, the US attention has been elsewhere over the weekend. We've seen, meanwhile, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth in Asia calling for Pacific allies to boost defense spending to face off threats from China. Has he maybe taken a more realistic approach in the Pacific than he was taking with Europe? And is the US right to take this almost zero-sum game approach to confronting China and letting Europe just deal with Russia?
It's a really interesting question, because one of the things that Hegseth was trying to do is reassure allies, but also to ensure that they're spending more money again so that deterrence works. One of the things that I've always liked in terms of deterrence theory is Montgomery's line from 1956, that when he was de-Sacker, that in Europe, for example, the test match was postponed indefinitely due to the deterrent effect of the NATO alliance. That would be the same with China's aspirations, in my view, to take to Taiwan, as long as America remains a good and trusted ally in the Indo-Pacific region. That is one of the things that Hegseth was trying to do. The problem with that at the moment is that there's skepticism about the long-term commitment of Trump, and also the erosion of the sort of soft power of America. Are they a trustworthy ally? So both of those things pertain in the Indo-Pacific region in the same way they pertain to the transatlantic relationship between Europe and America. So again, we're going to have to wait and see if that transpires. But if you can complicate the decision-making of China, you probably put off the notion of an attack on Taiwan. And the window of vulnerability has always been supposed to be opening in 2027, when China, in military terms, would have the military capacity and capability to invade what was known as the Davison window, from when Admiral Davidson was the commander of Indo-PACOM, as it was about 5 years ago. Now, if America will willingly come to the aid of Taiwan, that would complicate that. One of the things which is absolutely certain is that amphibious operations over somewhere between 100 and 120 miles of water is a difficult and complex operation, which has a lot of moving parts that you would need to get correct before you could even land. And so the indicators and warnings that would lead to a response would be there.
And meanwhile, back here in the UK, speaking of defence spending, we've had some of our strategic defence review published, outlining things like new warheads, naval drone involvement in naval strategy, and this ambition to get to a sort of 3% defence spend of GDP by 2034. Do you think that sends the right message to Russia? Are they going to see the UK as taking defence more seriously now?
I think they will, to a certain extent. There's always been this sort of mismatch between ambition and resources in the UK, and a sort of rhetoric reality gap. There still will be in certain areas, particularly in the army, I think, where there are around 71,000 personnel at the moment. We can't really, in a coherent way, take all our NATO responsibilities seriously. So, for example, the enhanced forward presence in Estonia, which should have a brigade, is allocated, not committed, because we'd have a difficulty of ruling a force at brigade strength of an armoured infantry type every 6 months. The thing which is interesting, I think, is because of the attack in the last few days by the Ukrainians, one of the scenarios that has always been on the cards is, could the Russians do a strategic attack using cruise missiles by the strategic aviation, which generally flies around from Murmansk around the sort of side of Norway, and launch an attack against the UK. Now, if you take a planning variable that four Blackjacks would each carry 12 KH-101 cruise missiles, launching 48 in the air. The quick reaction alert would be launched from RAF Lossiemouth. Each carries 8 missiles. They can knock down a certain number of missiles. Would the others get through? What I'm really saying here is, where is UK positioned in the integrated air and missile defence, both within NATO and within the UK? We know that the Strategic Defence Review has mentioned about upgrading radars. It does mention about being part of the NATO Sky Shield, but a number of people would say that there's a big hole in the integrated air and missile defense, ballistic missile, anti-ballistic missile capability within NATO. It'll be interesting to see how that goes from the theory, which is mentioned in the SDR, into practice, because that to me seems like a big vulnerability.
And just to finish, Chip, I do just want to come back to Ukraine just quickly. We've spoken a lot about strategy and some of the impact of the strategy versus tactics debate here in Ukraine. I want to ask you whether you think this strategy that sort of appeared can work. This idea that Ukraine can trade territory for time in places like the Donbass and even in Sumy now, possibly, while it does these sort of very calculated attacks on key strategic targets. Does that work going forwards into the long term, and where does it leave Ukraine in what it can achieve?
That's a great question. And what you've really outlined in a way is that trading territory for time is actually what is known as a delay operation. It used to be one of the 3 operations of war, along with the offence, defence, and therefore delay. So that is what delay is, trading territory for time. You can do that if you've got this zero-sum game that, for example, there was a report, I think in the FT a couple of months ago, that at the current rate of advance, Russia would take until 2256 to conquer all of Ukraine at the cost of 101 million casualties. Now, of course, that is absolutely absurd, and wars don't work in a linear fashion. The reason it might be done at the moment is, will we get in late 2025 to what Budanov said is the key thing this year, which is one of two things. Either the Russian economy has got to the point where it's going to implode, or secondly, that their equipment inventory is so degraded that they need a pause. It is only those two variables which really will lead possibly to a ceasefire this year, unless Russia can get to this point, which I don't think they can, of this surrender peace. And again, Ukraine doesn't think it is losing badly enough to go anywhere near that notion of a surrender peace with the objectives, political objectives, which the Russians have quite unequivocally stated in the last few years, including other oblasts, if they don't sign up now, Odessa, for example, Sumy, Kharkiv, and others.
Well, Chip Chapman, thank you very much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you, Louis.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can sign up for membership at the link below or subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also listen to the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.